welcome to this session on the Everything to Everybody project. And I'm absolutely delighted that we have with us Professor Ewan Fernie of the Shakespeare Institute of the University of Birmingham and very much of Birmingham itself. Ewan has spent much of his career completely reconfiguring the ways we think about Shakespeare in the academy, how we think about Shakespeare in relation to history, how we think about Shakespeare in relation to spirituality. He's always pressed against the artificial boundaries put between, for example, the academic study of Shakespeare and creative reworkings of Shakespeare. He and Simon Palfrey have published their own novelization of Macbeth. That's a novelization of Macbeth, which is called Macbeth, by the way. He is now pushing even further in that he is taking Shakespeare out onto the streets of Birmingham, rediscovering the 19th century utopianism that came within the Industrial Revolution to Birmingham, that sense of civic possibility and the possibilities of a rejuvenation of culture through the new forms made possible by mass production and urbanization. I know he has, the Everything to Everybody project, publicly funded. Birmingham is on board, Stratford is on board, and of course the Shakespeare Beyond Borders Alliance is very much trying to pick up on the slipstream of this great whoosh of a project. And Ewan, I believe, is going to show us some video to give you some sense of some of what's going on in that great city nearby.
Thank you, Michael. So I'll just do that straight away and then we'll talk, I think. So I need to press share screen, doing, and then I need to
start the show. Slideshow, that's it. Click on that. There we go. Right.
So you can see that now.
Yep.
So there we go.
Πότε μύρια λεπτά λαλούμενα σιγοκελαηδούν στα αυτιά μου. Πότε φωνές και σε ξύπνησα από τον πολύ ύπνο με κάνουν και αποκοιμιέμαι. Και πότε της υπνοφαντασίας μου τα νέφη φαίνοντέ μου σκίζονται.
Galoppate veloci cavalli dai piedi di fuoco alla dimora di Febo. Un cocchiere come Fetonte vi spingerebbe a colpi di frusta verso ovest e introdurrebbe subito l'ombrosa notte.
Deze slikkok, dis en ik en vis, miskan Afrika.
Now is the winter of our discontent. Make glorious summer by this son of York, and all the clouds that loud upon our house in the deep bosom of the ocean buried.
Nicht alles muss zeigen und manches verschwiegen, nicht alles liegen.
Now darling. Homme c'est toi. Je suis au-dessus de toi. Mais n'aie pas peur de la grandeur. Il y a ceux qui sont les grands. Certains qui atteignent la grandeur. Et certains d'autres, la grandeur qui leur est imposée.
Πιο πλούσια κάτω από πυκνόφυλλη σκεπή, ξαπλώνονται οι ερωτικοί διαλογισμοί.
Or bid me go into a new-made grave and hide me with a dead man in his shroud. And I'll do it without fear or doubt, to live an unstained wife to my sweet love.
가혹한 운명의 화살이 꽂힌 고통을 참고 죽으며 살아가든 그것이 옳은 것인지 아니면 죽음으로써 거침없는 파도처럼 몰려드는 그것이 옳은 것인지 죽는 것, 자는 것, 차이가 무엇인가?
Is this a dagger which I see before me? The
handle towards my hand. Come, let me clutch thee. I have thee not, yet I see thee still.
Pontida uia du iskenzi honen, egis ocritis asuia uhonen. Il mila el esia de hunen de honen de critis ohonen.
Muy pronto le he visto y tarde le conozco. Fatal nacimiento de amor habrá sido, si tengo que amar al peor enemigo.
I know a bank where the wild thyme blows, where oxlips and the nodding violet grows.
একটি বোকা জঙ্গলে ওর সঙ্গে দেখা করলাম ওই যে একটি বোকা
જો તમે મને ભમરો સમજો તો તમે મારા ઢંકનો ખ્યાલ રાખજો.
Okay. Trying to move things on. So that was Michael and I get to talk about it when I surrender to what will be his elegant and interesting questions, but that was a taste really of some of the, about half of the 94 languages are presented in a series of films that are available on our website. There are 94 languages in the collection. It is the first great Shakespeare library in the world. It was established in 1864 for all the citizens of the city. This is the Shakespeare Memorial Room, which was built in 1882 after a fire consumed the library and much of its collection, but it was handsomely restored and massively exceeded its original holdings. This currently sits in the top of the Golden Cap, which is of the Library of Birmingham, which was one of the great civic building projects, which was financed just before the financial crash. So I wanted to show you that, and I'll show you one more image and then we'll go to Michael. This is what Emma Smith, the doyen of the first folio, oops, that's gone too far, but suggests is the people's folio, and I'll stop there because the PowerPoint is playing up. So Abigail, would you mind please stopping me from yeah, she's done that.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, one wonderful images and a fascinating bit of film. Daniel Tyler, the director,
yeah,
I think it's very shrewd the way he decides only to surtitle the bits that are in English.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's the English speakers, the Anglophones, who become the strangers.
Exactly. Yeah.
In the thing, and our knowledge of Shakespeare is what allows us to test our knowledge of all these other languages, and
indeed, yeah.
Try desperately to learn them in order to recognize what all these different young people are saying. Since Birmingham has not only an incredibly diverse population, but a very young population. I mean, that's not a bad cross-section.
It does, yeah. It's the youngest city in Europe, in fact.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. And this newly industrialized place that would become famous for making cheap metal goods that would be, all over the world, sort of in machine tools and brass farthings and all those other sort of Dickensian Birmingham artifacts, because Dickens himself spends a lot of time in Birmingham. It acquires or sets up this public library just about Shakespeare. Why? How did that happen?
Yeah, so I think there are complex reasons for it. One is we both and many, perhaps everybody listening knows, that it was in 1864, so a lot of people were celebrating Shakespeare's big 300th birthday then. So most immediately they wanted to do something in Birmingham. Birmingham is a new place. It's only been incorporated as a town in the 1830s. It's not yet a city. As you know, Michael, in Shakespeare's lifetime, it's about the size of Stratford. So it's suddenly there as a kind of new metropolis. And so part of it, I think, is claiming something of Shakespeare's cultural capital. Or it's easier for us to think that, but actually to some extent it precedes a lot of what we recognise as Shakespeare's cultural capital, and they wanted to do something different in Birmingham. So there's a brilliant document in the archives of the Library of Birmingham, which, you know, it's the committee room agenda basically, such as you know, lots of us see a lot of, but they've crossed out statue or memorial and they've written library, and it's a rather wonderful thing. You know, it documents that decision. And George Dawson, who we'll perhaps talk about, who was the sort of visionary impetus behind the establishment of the library, he said, he sort of growled, let Stratford endow its own boys. So as far as memorializing Shakespeare, they thought this was where you're seated, or no, you're not, you're in, we would be at Shakespeare, or at least some of us would be at the Shakespeare Institute, is the place to establish a statue to Shakespeare. But Birmingham wished to make something for absolutely as an engine for culture in the present. And there's another beautiful and extraordinary thing is a cartoon of one of the other founders of the library looking for Shakespeare's footprints on the banks of the River Ray, with the smokestacks of Birmingham behind him. So they, in Birmingham, they were committed to Shakespeare as sort of the new poet, as the poet of the new world, to Birmingham as another version of New Place. Yeah, and Shakespeare, because he's comes out of the popular theatre, because he writes in the vernacular, because his works don't require massive erudition or a classical education for people to understand them, becomes a kind of secular patron saint of an idea of a city where people are all equal partners in the conversation. Yeah, exactly. It's very well put. You know, I love it. It's wonderful to see again the stamp on that folio, and to know that all them, you know, if you divided up the value of that book in cash terms among all the people of Birmingham, they'd still get an appreciable bonus. You know, you get sort of £3 each or something, wouldn't you? It would be quite good. I mean, I'm not suggesting they should, because you know, it's such a remarkable thing. Of course, Birmingham is the metropolis, this new kind of mega city which is emerging with all these mills and factories and canals, that's the nearest to Shakespeare's birthplace, and this is clearly something going on. I mean, I think we forget how closely the development of the Shakespeare industry is tied to the Industrial Revolution. That Stratford is on the canal network. That you know, Stratford is directly connected to Birmingham and was involved in textiles and in shipping commodities up and down. It was part of the whole population explosion that comes with industrialism in the 18th century. That's one of the reasons there are enough people around to come to the Shakespeare Jubilee in '69. Of course, Stratford depends on the railways to bring in more pilgrims and more visitors, many of them directly from Birmingham. What have you found in terms of the city's knowledge of its Shakespearean heritage and willingness to sort of readopt it? What's the response been? Yeah, so I mean, we've talked about this before, and I mean, the fortunes of the Shakespeare Memorial Library in Birmingham are really quite extreme. So I think you said, Michael, that when you began your PhD, you were directed to this huge 7-volume catalogue. It was very much a resource. I think, you know, there's not that much difference in our ages, but I think by the time I was at the same stage, that wasn't the case. And there's been a kind of drastic falling off, not only of public knowledge and ownership of this collection, but actually of academic knowledge and ownership of it. I mean, there are 100,000 things in it. It's got 100 books that were printed before 1700. It's by any standards. It's as I know you'll agree. It's a great Shakespeare collection. But as to public knowledge and ownership, that's dwindled even more alarmingly, really. And I think there's complex reasons for that one of the reasons is us, really, to be honest. That Shakespeare isn't even a school book, as they say at the time when they established the Shakespeare Memorial Library, and in a sense, as you've intimated, offers a kind of alternative culture, a sort of free culture. They're called free libraries. And of course, he's progressively institutionalized in education, and we will benefit from that, and there are massive gains and so forth. But it does, as Andrew Murphy's book also suggests, as many of us will know, it also involves a kind of steady erosion of that popular investment in Shakespeare, which has been reversed in some ways with film and so on. But until in 2016, which again, as everybody watching or listening knows, it was a significant Shakespeare year. There were, I think, 12 people used the Birmingham Shakespeare Memorial Library. There are, 3 million people in Greater Birmingham, and my counterpart on the project at the library says he thinks most of those 12 people were me. So that's a terrible result, really, for a vision, as you say, of a kind of shared, collaboratively made culture. Having said that, to the rest of your question, we found that there's a lot of appetite in Birmingham. People don't know this, but don't know about it. But when you tell them about it, and crucially when you tell them, and this was a bit of an accident, really, when you begin by telling them it's theirs, it does sort of miraculous things, really. So it's not me sharing what is ours, culturally, but restoring to them what is theirs. And so we did a couple of, when we were bidding for the money from the Heritage Fund, who I should credit my gratitude to, but we did a couple of sort of open days for community groups and artistic organisations in Birmingham, and they were very oversubscribed, and everybody wanted to be involved. So we've been thrilled, really. We have about 50 collaborating institutions. We realised that my going, or anyone else on the project going to these communities and saying directly, this is yours, and I'd like it, it wasn't going to work. So it's brokered through organisations and people who know their own audiences and communities, and there's a very much a principle of co-curation running throughout. We are not, sort of speaking to the previous panel, that we can't and are not absolutely curating or this collection for the people. We're seeking to reinvent it with the people, if that doesn't sound too.
No, not at all. And it very recognisably, to connect up again with some of what's been said this morning, it very much, as a 19th century utopian public enterprise, it very much connects up with the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, which brings Shakespeare's birthplace into public ownership, which is managing this, setting up this museum of Shakespeare, this place of pilgrimage for Shakespeare's life, as a national institution, and that's for all Shakespeare's admirers all around the world, rather than leaving it to be a commercial enterprise or a private property. It's a very interesting moment, as I know you're discovering through the studies you're doing in it, in thought, as 19th century intellectuals who've been trained in an essentially feudal view of culture, based on land ownership and private manuscript libraries, start trying to cope with the fact that there's been a print revolution, and now there's an industrial revolution, and lots of people are learning to read, and there are these cities where people can share everything. I'm interested in the paradox between the fact that it's the industrial revolution in this country that enables this kind of egalitarian utopianism, but one of the things that enables that industrial revolution is actually the empire. It's actually acquiring raw materials and captive markets in other parts of the world from people who aren't being let in on it, who aren't having this culture shared with them in anything like the same way. Is that something that you've that's kind of shows up in the shape of the collection from its early years, and something it's kind of compensating for now?
Yes, I mean, again, very good questions. Yes, in short, I mean, it's one of the agencies we're kind of working with is the Commonwealth Games, which is coming to Birmingham, as we all know, in 2022. And it is, of course, an imperial and Commonwealth and post-colonial collection, really. I mean, it describes that sort of arc. I mentioned the 94 languages. Many of them are languages from the Commonwealth, and actually, sort of amazingly and interestingly, I think the consuls and ambassadors. I know this conference has featured one of them, but of the first part of the 20th century, were actually tasked with acquiring materials for the Birmingham Shakespeare Memorial Library. So there are letters from Ethiopia with original Shakespearean texts and so forth in the collection. So certainly that imprint is there. Having said that, there's a lot of Russian material in the collection as well, and that's never been part of the British Empire, as some of your other delegates would stress, I'm sure. And there was an amazing moment in '64, which again, of course, another great anniversary year, as we all know, where the Soviets contravened all their own red tape and came to Birmingham and deposited 300 sort of unique holdings, including Kazakh charcoal drawings and so on. So yes, there is that tension. It's not absolutely a British Empire collection. It's worth saying. The other thing, which of course your question knows, Michael, but is then the question is what we do with it now, and what we do with it in a post-colonial city, which is whose current population is partly and complexly related to the history of empire. And one of our collaborators is Islam Issa, who of course is a UOB PhD and is a great friend of the Institute, and he is Egyptian Brummy, and we're talking to him about opening these questions up. And indeed, we've also, as part of the project, we're commissioning, sponsoring some young citizen researchers who will tell this story for themselves and to themselves. I suppose the other thing is that all those languages now we have to make them, all of us, not just the project, the city, I suppose, if it doesn't sound pompous, but have to make them a positive resource, and that's the intention of the film that we share.
I mean, it's wonderful. I mean, I think the film is wonderfully continuous with the collection in its multilingualism and in its sense of Shakespeare being this large mental rendezvous or imaginative space, which can draw in and establish relationships that are lateral. I think the kind of archaeology you're doing into these international acquisitions of the collection and the gift, the sense of Shakespeare as a gift and Shakespeare as somebody who inspires gifts and provides an occasion for gifts, I think is really fascinating, because I know there's of course, because of Germany being the kind of first world great power in professionalized Shakespeare studies in the 19th century, there's a lot of German stuff in there.
There's an extraordinary amount of German stuff. I mean, I think something like 2/3 of the books were German when the fire happened, which is an amazing thing. And again, not enough people in Shakespeare studies know. And of course, Claudia Rolk was averting to this yesterday. So you can see the shifts of those global shifts that we've only recently come to appreciate in Anglophone Shakespeare studies as much as or we're coming to appreciate as much as we should do. So at first they look absolutely to Germany, and in 1864 the Gesellschaft, the oldest national Shakespeare society in the world, honors and presents the Jahrbuch to the oldest Shakespeare journal, to the Birmingham Shakespeare Memorial Library, and great German scholars come to visit, Delius and others. Then in the 1870s, there's a bit of a shift towards America, actually, and American collectors start to donate to Birmingham. I suppose just to pick up on what you said about Empire, Michael, one thing that interests me there, or sort of not counterpoints that a little bit, is that Birmingham is it is an imperial centre, but of course, in terms of British cultural geography, it's very much an alternative centre, and certainly in the 19th century. So I think Matthew Arnold is concerned about Birmingham as unbalancing the cultural geography of the country. And the fact that till well into the 1960s, so 100 years later, there's still that kind of cultural capital dignity, whatever we might call it, and then that is radically eroded is interesting, I think, in English terms. And I spoke to Iqbal Khan about this, and he said, hang on a minute, there is imperial guilt and difficulty and big issues, uncomfortable issues for us to think through here, but there's also a kind of threat to it, the internal colonialism that goes on in English culture. And I think that's a very important point. And you know, this was a library set up by non-conformists who lived in a segregated world. Again, I mean, I'm guilty of this myself. We forget this. They weren't allowed to occupy public office. They couldn't go to Oxford and Cambridge. They couldn't, you know, we talked about this sort of thing before. But this as a phenomenon it's not just coming out of establishment culture. It has there's a judder which I think we can work with now.
Yeah, absolutely. That lost world of artisan self-improvement and sharing culture within working class and lower middle class communities, and particularly around non-conformist churches. I mean, as you know, I'm from a Methodist family, and you know, my grandfather, is up on the wall of my Stratford office behind me, set up the Little Theatre in Middlesbrough, and that's, you know, which connects us back to the amateurs panel. It's the same kind of cultural alternative to Oxbridge and the elite and Latin.
Absolutely.
That happens in the industrial cities, and that adopts Shakespeare as the people's writer.
As you said,
as this library makes so spectacularly visible. And you've got people researching both the history of the library and the library's kind of networks around the world, as I understand it.
Yes. I mean, we're working with some great international scholars, including Catherine Scheil at the University of Minnesota, and Tobias Düring in Germany, and Peter Holbrook and David McInnes and others in Australia. So there are all sorts of links, and as sort of, I suppose it follows on from what we're saying, again, a sense that the English culture isn't just metropolitan in terms of coming out of London, that Shakespeare isn't just out of the London, Stratford axis. And I suppose what we, you know, historically, that suggests that we could do more in more places beyond established borders, perhaps. Now, but I suppose the other thing to admit and perhaps stress even is that there would be, to an academic audience, is one way we could have proceeded. And again, you and I spoke about this, Michael, when the project was in its development. It would have made perfectly good sense, and may indeed still be worth doing, to kind of really rediscover this library as a sort of, you know, great scholarly library misplaced in a public library in Birmingham, you know. But when we looked at its origins, it seemed, you know, if you're going to do something with it, you had to at least try. It does officially belong to Birmingham City Council, and therefore all to the people of the city, and it's got to work for them. We've got to see if it can. So that's what we're trying to do. So the other kind of research is represented in, you know, sort of by synecdoche in the film you saw, but there's a whole load, I mean, you know, an enormous number of events and reappropriations and reanimations and reimaginings of Shakespeare, which are done absolutely by the people of the city. And I hope, well, I know myself that I'm learning a lot from that, and I hope it will change our ideas of Shakespeare and change and allow other interpreters and creators to come into the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And that, of course, includes everybody who is online for this conference. And I hope they're making connections and will be sending us suggestions and feeling part of that democratic, originally 19th century sense of Shakespeare as connected to all movements of liberation. Which you've written about so brilliantly in Shakespeare for Freedom, that sense that 19th century liberalism that comes with industrialism draws some of its energy from the popular literary tradition, and we go beyond that through bringing our own energies and taking our own energies from these plays, which have produced such extraordinary work in the world. Not just all the statues, but these artistic institutions and this amazing public library. What's the thing that's most surprised you so far, either about the collection or about the ways in which people respond to everything to everybody?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's such a big collection that I have different favorites every day, and we find all sorts of different things. And of course, it's properly humbling, the size of the collection and so forth. And I think it really demonstrates to anybody, or could demonstrate to anybody, even Sir Stanley, that Shakespeare, it transcends the limits of any particular position, any imagination, and so it requires a collaborative cultural international conversation. So there's that. I mean, in terms of the project, I mean, the bliss of that really is just the sheer inventiveness that people have shown in responding to it. So please do check us out on Twitter. Chris kindly shared the link. But so this week we've had an organisation called Desi Blitz in the library, and they're I think the biggest British Asian web magazine. They have many thousands of people engaged with it. They're based in Birmingham. Indy Diol is the leading light there. And they came to us and they said, well, we'd like to do an exhibition. There's so many South Asian languages in the collection, but what we'd really like to do is dress up a Punjabi bus as an elephant, take that, put things on the bus from the collection in this range of South Asian languages, which include languages like Telugu, which I should have heard of but hadn't, and many others, and then take the bus to the people who will recognize these scripts, rather, because as perhaps something we might turn back to, but when I spoke to my friend at Birmingham City Council who works on the project, he said, well, there are borders and stumbling blocks and so forth, and you've got to work with them, around them, etc. we talked about. But yeah, so the idea was to take the bus in, take these materials to the people who can read and interpret them, make the bus a bit of a mobile home for those people over several months, bring the bus in a kind of festive procession back to the centre of the city, up to the top of the Shakespeare Memorial Room, where those people who've been involved in that project will then almost physically install their version of Birmingham Shakespeare, and that thrilled me. I thought it was a wonderful piece of civic theatre.
No, that's superb. No, I love the idea of the bus as this literally a vehicle for bringing the language and placing the book actually inside the building, and the very fact that it's a bus, this kind of omnibus, it's for everyone. It's public transport.
Yeah, no, that's a good point.
It's industrial public transport at that. No, that's rather good. I know there's also Polish material in the collection. There are theatre posters, there are film stills. You know, there are pictures, as I know, of one of our panelists earlier in the conference, Kelly Hunter's grandfather,
Yes.
in Max Reinhardt's Midsummer Night's Dream. It's wonderfully multidisciplinary. It's a kind of astonishing kind of jumble sale of all these different genres and art forms in which Shakespeare has generated interest and effort and engagement. Of course, Daniel Tyler himself did his brilliant Hamlet show, actually site-specific, starting at the Memorial Library and going through the building. Do you feel there's a rivalry for Shakespeare between Birmingham and Stratford and London, quite apart from other places that wanted to be Shakespearean venues?
I mean, I think Birmingham hasn't figured much for quite a long time with the same sort of, on the same scale that Stratford and London can, but there is an alternative story, as we both know, about Shakespeare in Birmingham. And it's very, very significant that this first great Shakespeare library in the world, which remains the biggest collection held in public ownership, is in the city. So it's ripe for rediscovery, I think. The other thing to say there is, and again, I know you know this better than I do, Michael, but the Birmingham Repertory Theatre is the first theatre in the world to perform Shakespeare in modern dress. As some people listening who know the city will know, the Birmingham Rep sits literally cheek by jowl with the library. Then we almost share premises. That's an amazing thing. So the first Shakespeare Library belongs to all the people of the city, is in more than 90 languages. Bang next door to it is the first company to perform Shakespeare in modern dress. If you put those two things together, there's something
in modern times.
Sorry?
In modern times. I mean, I think Shakespeare was doing Shakespeare.
Yes,
as was Barry. Yeah,
indeed. But it's a very, very remarkable conjunction, and has yet to be, I think, as electrified as it might be. But I think in many ways it's a good moment for Birmingham, and who knows, we never know what might or might not happen. And as Terence Hawkes used to say, we've got to try.
Yes. Well, I mean, thank you for trying, and thank you for being part of the unexpected result, and part of the Birmingham that is coming into being, which is already, I think, a more exciting city than it was when I first knew it. Certainly,
there's a lot going on, I think,
and in lots of other ways too. I mean, again, it's one of those side effects of industrialism. Was one got industrial philanthropists who were invested in funding civic projects rather than in setting up elite spaces in their own names, and Joseph Chamberlain and Barry Jackson among them. Joseph Chamberlain, who puts lots of money into the library, lots of money into the university. Barry Jackson, who directs those modern dress Shakespeares, and who also sets up the Birmingham Rep, and who also, in collaboration with Allardyce Nicholl, helps set up the Shakespeare Institute here in Stratford. I mean, this is something that couldn't have happened if it had been left up to the landed aristocracy, the way it used to be in Shakespeare's time.
No, I mean, again, many listeners will know the phrase "made in Birmingham," which, to go back to what you said at the beginning, conjures images of vulgar manufactory. But I think part of the point here is that Shakespeare is partly made in Birmingham. The RSC is partly made in Birmingham. The idea of the National Theatre, and I'll defer to you on this, Michael, but is partly made in Birmingham. I mean, you mentioned philanthropists, the Tangis brothers, who endowed Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery, which is still the greatest collection of pre-Raphaelite art in the world. But they also went to Sydney, and where they flogged their hydraulic pumps. And while they were there, they went to the libraries, because they were Birmingham men. That's what they did. It's a Cornish name, but they came to Birmingham, and they gave the only first folio in Australia to New South Wales Library. So again, this, as I say, this sort of international cultural geography that has a somewhat different origin than we might think is I think instructive.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a shame that they didn't succeed in doing what they were trying to do in 2016, which was rename Birmingham International Airport William Shakespeare.
I didn't know that.
I hope it'll happen. We should title, and there should be an airport bus shaped like an elephant that recites Shakespeare in many, many different languages to all travellers as they come in and out. And thank you to all those who've travelled with us during this panel. We're now coming up to time for a very rapid lunch break. So whatever fusion cuisine you're going to sample, think of the Birmingham Shakespeare Library while you eat it. It's an incredibly appetizing idea. It's a fantastic collection. And this commitment to the way in which Shakespeare is something in which everyone or anyone can have an emotional stake without spending a fortune on a first folio in private hands is a wonderful idea and absolutely central to the canon, I think. So many, many thanks to Professor Fernie for everything he's doing and for coming along today. And after the break, it's Digital Shakespeares with Rowan and Erin Sullivan and other digital persons from around the world. But meanwhile, for the moment, thank you very much again,
Michael. Yeah.
And again
Thanks,
to all
everybody.
of you. See you a little later.